Hello, I'm Ward Bell of IdeaBlade with another in a series of videos about the TempHire Cocktail Reference Application. My good friend and colleague Marcel Good is the Chief Architect and Principal Maintainer of Cocktail, an open source framework for end-to-end development of XAML-based business applications. Marcel gave me a guided tour of the TempHire application, and this series is the result. In this episode, we visit the TempHire Domain Services module, with its components for creating entities, querying, saving, and other model-oriented services. We'll see the unit of work, the host component for entity factories, repositories, and other services. We'll meet the EntityManagerProvider that delivers a configured DevForce EntityManager to the unit of work. It's a very important class, and we'll look at it closely.
We're going to look at the domain services project a little closer. This is basically where we have all of our persistence ignorance. This is where we have the repositories, as mentioned before, the factories that create new entities, services that do some logic on our domain objects, business logic, business processes, things like that. And we have the unit of work. The unit of work represents a task or a workflow or a business process that the user initiates from the UI. And it tracks all the changes related to that task, that workflow, and it ultimately saves them or rejects them. So let's look at this a little more, what that looks like. So we open up the interface for the unit of work that is used in TempHire, and we notice three things. There are factories. Well, there's actually only one. There are repositories, and there are services. So that's in general how a unit of work is made up, right? It gives you access to the data. It allows you to create new entities. It allows you to fetch them through repositories. And it allows you to call business processes that are related to the unit of work.
Now, in the DevForce unit of work, the idea is that it would be paired with an entity manager, and that entity manager would be providing the container for, well, in this case, addresses, states, and so forth. And so you kind of use repositories to get at the different types that are all collectively held in that container.
That is correct. So let's look at the implementation to add on to that point. So we've seen the interface before. This is the implementation of the unit of work. We're looking at the constructor primarily, which we'll notice one thing it gets is an entity manager provider. So as you said, a unit of work is aligned with an entity manager. Mm-hmm. And in fact, a unit of work should always be a sandbox so that the entity manager behind it is only used for the current instance of the unit of work, right? So you really treat it as one contained set of changes that represent something that the user performs in the UI. Mm-hmm. So we're getting an entity manager provider injected from Cocktail right through MEF, and we're making sure that we're getting a non-shared one, as we can see with the import attribute specified in front. So that tells MEF that we want a new instance here.
Right, and it's a new instance of an entity manager provider because that provider is going to be in charge of delivering a properly configured entity manager to you.
That's correct, yeah. There's a lot around an entity manager, like it needs to be authenticated, it needs some connection details, things like that, right? At this level, you really don't want to have to worry about it, right? Some other part of your application makes sure that your entity managers are configured properly, and the entity manager provider will give you an instance of such a properly configured entity manager.
And I imagine that if one of the virtues of this is that I could be in a test environment and I'd get an entity manager configured for test. I'd get another one for faking. I'd get a different one for production. But from the code's perspective, just give me one.
Yeah, exactly. Then the second piece, this preloader here, that's used to load some of the static data that really doesn't change, but you don't want to have to constantly go get from the database. Mm-hmm. So this preloader actually has an entity manager behind it as well. And after the login, it basically populates itself with the static data. And then every entity manager that gets created subsequently, the first thing it does, it initializes its cache with the static data that you have preloaded, right? So all your static data is then available.
So let me get this straight. There, in any application, there are certain kinds of data that don't change very much during the session.
Yeah.
Colors, shapes, or address types.
Yeah. Or they may never change.
They may never change.
Yeah.
So during the login, you'd put these all in one little manager, and then even though I'm creating up new entity managers as I go from one view to another view to another view, I don't have to go back to the database to get the color, shapes, types, address types.
Yeah.
I would just pull them out of this shared hole.
Yeah.
I would copy them into my entity manager, and then I would get them. That would make it pretty efficient.
Yes, yes. And we can see that further down here that there is a special type of repository that is used for address types, states, phone numbers, rate types. That repository is preloader aware, if you will. It knows that this data is already preloaded, so instead of this repository going back out to the database, it actually gets the data from the preloaded set.
Got it.
And we can see that this is really the persistence ignorance that we're talking about. This is all hidden in the unit of work and in the repositories. So you can really optimize your repositories specifically per entity type and for specific scenarios.
Right. So if I'm a consumer of the unit of work and I ask for the address types repository, I can't tell whether it's preloaded or not. It's
Correct.
Just, for me, it's the same as, say, one of the ones here that isn't like
Staffing
resources.
Yeah.
Got it.
Yeah. And so then besides the repositories that we're setting up the factory, which actually also uses a special factory. We'll look at that one in a minute. We set up the repository for the staffing resource. It's also a special repository for staffing resources. And we set up the search service. Right? And you can see that basically the unit of work passes the same entity manager provider that it gets to all of these nested objects. So that ensures that all these guys work on the same data set that is tracked by the unit of work.
All the individual repositories are coordinating through this single unit of work, through a single entity manager.
Yes.
Got it.
Correct. All right, so this is the unit of work. So let's look at some of the components that make up the unit of work. So the first one is the staffing resource factory. We'll see here that the factory extends factory T. This is actually a class provided by Cocktail. So Cocktail has very intelligent base implementations for a factory, for a repository, for a unit of work, not for a service, because services are very specific to your application. And in this particular case, we need to modify slightly how a staffing resource gets created. Right? By default, the implementation that ships with Cocktail, it looks for a factory method on the entity, and if it doesn't find one, it just tries to use the default constructor to create a new entity. So you have a way to control how you want to have your entity be created, right? But if it's more complicated, for example, you need to fetch additional data and you actually want to build a graph, not just a single entity, you can take control over the entire creation process, which we have done here. So you'll see that creating a staffing resource is actually not just creating a staffing resource entity, it's actually creating a little graph here, right?
So it's all the things that like Steven has there, and he has addresses and he has rates and he has all the phone.
So in this case, we're actually saying whenever you create a new staffing resource, you need to have at least an address and at least a phone number, right? So these are two mandatory things that you always have to have. So for this purpose, the factory gets actually a repository to fetch an address type, and it gets a repository to fetch a phone number type. We can see that from the constructor, and that repository is passed into here from the unit of work.
It's the same one we were just looking at.
The same one we were just looking at. When the unit of work instantiates this factory, it gives it the entity manager provider, the address type, and phone number type repositories. And then if we look at what's actually happening when somebody says they need a new staffing resource, it first creates a staffing resource, it attaches it to the entity manager that lies behind all this. Then from the address type repository, it gets the default address type. So we can actually flag a default address type in the database. It gets that and it creates an address and attaches it to the staffing resource from that type. And it does the same thing for the phone numbers.
Got it. Now you're using a yield return here.
Yes. So it's a coroutine. So the staffing resource we created now, we need to return from our coroutine.
So there's a possibility that it wouldn't be in memory and it would actually have to have made a trip out to the server? Is that why it's async?
No, remember, yes. So fetching the data might have to go to the server.
Right.
Yeah.
The first time it might have to go to the server.
First time it might have to go to the server.
Later on, because we knew that this address type is one of your preloads,
Yeah.
but the first time it may have to go.
Yeah, exactly.
So just in case, because you can't tell.
Just in case, because we can now, we write the code as if we had to go to the database. But we can later on, if we find out this performs really poorly, we can go optimize the address type repository and actually tell it, well, cache your address types.
Mm-hmm.
This code doesn't have to change. It doesn't even have to know that it's now all of a sudden the data is in the cache, right? That's simply hidden it. This finishes synchronous, but you actually coded it the safe way that if it has to go to the database, you're still okay.
That's great.
And that's why the creation signature, if we look at the factory, let's just quickly look at the interface. We can drill in the factory T. So this is the base factory implementation, which implements iFactory. And iFactory has an asynchronous signature for the create method, and this actually starts the coroutine that we saw before, right?
Okay.
So the factory is built for additional data fetching because the whole signature is asynchronous, right?
And it makes sense to therefore hide complex creation activities like this inside a factory rather than try and plumb this through with news and things, you know, you don't
exactly.
want a new object.
Yeah.
You don't want to do that.
Creating an entity is not always just creating a single entity. You often actually want to create an entity graph, right?
Yep.
All right, so this is the factory. And then the next thing is we look at the repository. Let's look at the staffing resource repository. Again, we can see this extends from repository of T.
Mm-hmm.
That's a cocktail-provided implementation, which is actually quite rich. It has a lot of methods that allow you to fetch data in any various forms. You can fetch a single entity. You can fetch a list of entity based on a predicate. You can sort that list if you want to. You can even do a projection, so you can actually provide shape information and it will project the data into whatever type that you need.
And there's a cocktail I repository of T, right?
There's a cocktail I repository T, yeah. So again, if we drill in here, so this is the repository implementation, implements I repository of T. And if we scroll down here, there are a bunch of with ID methods. So there are a few different ways by which you can get a single entity. You can let the repository figure out whether it should come from cache or the data source. You can explicitly retrieve it from the cache, from the data source, or you can explicitly retrieve it from the cache. Right?
Okay.
And it has different signatures to support single primary keys or composite primary keys, right? So it does all that.
All right. So it's good to know that it's an interface if I want to do it, but I'm probably going to want to use the cocktail implementation.
Yes, that is correct. Now the staffing resource repository does a minor customization. It customizes the query that is used to retrieve a single entity. So that's a overridable protected method that you get from repository of T, where you can actually override the query that should be used to retrieve a single entity. And as you can see, in this case, we're making sure that whenever a staffing resource is fetched, we bring the addresses and the phone numbers along with it.
Uh-huh. Do I have to do the specialization of a repository of T for every type that
No, you don't.
So I could just return a repository of something else if I didn't have any of this special logic?
Yes.
The only reason I'm doing this class here is because you want to do something special when they do get key
Because I know for the scenario I'm using this repository for, I know I'm always displaying addresses and phone numbers.
Got it.
Right. And so this is a level of optimization that I have applied to this repository.
Makes sense.
Then the third piece we've seen in the unit of work is a search service. So the detail screen we saw in TempHire, the grid actually had a search capability. Right?
Mm-hmm.
Now, what it means to search for a staffing resource, that should be hidden from a view model that actually does the search, right? That's a perfect place for a domain service that is attached to the unit of work. It knows how you actually want to search, right? So this particular search service implements a simple search method that the view model calls, and you get the search text that is passed in from the view.
Well, so what's simple about it is that the user experience is simple.
Yes.
You get a text box, you get some text.
Yeah.
What you do with that text could be complicated.
That is correct, yeah.
Okay.
And it's simple from the view model perspective too, because the view model just takes whatever the user entered and it hands it over to the search service and says, you go figure out what that means.
Right.
And all I need back is an IEnumable of our projection object that we saw earlier when we were looking at the domain model. So this is actually where the projection object is used.
All right. So if I understand this correctly, I'm taking that little bit of text that I type in there, and you're saying, well, I want the item if the first name has it, the middle name has it, last name has it, or it's anywhere in the address, or it's anywhere in the phone number. So you're just sort of combining that all together in an OR filter.
So exactly. So I'm building out the predicate expression here, and then I'm using a method on the repository that this is a cocktail implementation, right? I don't actually have to write the code to ultimately run this query. And this method signature actually allows me to do a projection. So the first parameter, I'm specifying a selector that shapes my result. And I'm passing in the filter that I've just built up there, and I'm passing it an order by criteria, and then my default or the cocktail default implementation of the repository knows how to turn this into an actual query, run it against the entity manager, and return the data.
Wow. And that staffing resource list item that we saw we were looking at the domain model and the projection.
Exactly.
Got it.
So this is our projection
That's
object.
A
strongly typed
projection object. And you're just sort of making little linky fragments here and assembling them together into one link thing. So that makes it pretty dynamic.
So the base implementation of the repository is actually very flexible, and it still maintains persistence ignorance. You actually never see a query, but you can provide individual link expression fragments that ultimately get used in composing the query under the hood. So that was the service, and then the next thing we want to look at is this unit of work manager. Let's open it up. It looks very simple because, again, it relies on a component in Cocktail, which is the object manager. So basically what this manager allows you to do is find instances of your unit of work by means of a key. In a UI scenario where you may have multiple independent parts, view models and views that are actually working on the same data, they need a way to find the unit of work.
So you're saying maybe that if I have a guy named Steven and I have a guy named Paul, I'm editing them simultaneously, sort of jockeying back and forth between them. When I want to to go back to the editor of Stephen, there I'm able to find the unit of work associated with the ongoing edit to Stephen.
Yes.
And then when I'm ready to go to Paul, I can find the unit of work associated with editing
Yes.
him. And then if I suddenly go for Susan, it'll say I don't have it. It'll create a new one.
It'll create a new one. Exactly.
And that will also be findable through here.
Yes. Yeah.
Got it.
So that's one scenario. The other scenario, we'll talk about that a little later, where the UI is composed together of multiple view models that actually all are working on Steve, right? You're editing Steve, but one view model is responsible for editing Steve's addresses. The other view model is responsible for editing Steve's phone numbers. But they all need to be editing the same Steve instance, right?
So they're sharing.
They're
the unit
sharing.
Of work.
They
Different
all,
view models sharing
exactly.
the same
They
unit of
all
work.
getting the same manager injected, and then they all say, "Hey, I'm working on Steve with ID 123," right? And so they ask the manager to give them the unit of work that is currently editing the Steve that we're all editing together.
The staffing resource.
The staffing resource.
123, yes. Who is Steve.
The one, yes,
right.
That's correct. Yeah.
Got it.
So it's a way to loosely share a unit of work in your UI. Maintain loose coupling, but have one guy who knows if you give him a key to this manager, it knows you which unit of work to give back. Or if you give it a new key, it can actually start the new unit of work and give you that one back.
Great. And as a view model, I don't have to know whether it's new or old.
Yeah.
It's just give it to me.
Correct. Correct. So that's the unit of work manager. And then lastly, we mentioned this before as well. We take a quick look at something called a sample data provider. So we mentioned earlier that DevForce has something called the fake backing store. So if you don't want to develop against the real database, you can have this in-memory sort of database, if you will. You initialize it with your known sample data, and you can develop very quickly against it. You don't have the overhead of a database. If the database is shared, you're not messing up each other's data on a team, right? You have this isolated experience, and it's faster too because the queries run against the memory structure.
So it's faster, and you're always repopulating it from scratch. Saves don't actually hurt anything.
Yes.
There's no rollback or anything like that. So you're dealing with known data, and it's very fast. And I can imagine this would be pretty useful in a test environment too, where for each test I want a known state.
Yeah, or the screen harness.
Or the screen harness, where you want a known state.
Yeah,
that
exactly.
Makes sense.
Yeah. So the sample data provider gets discovered by Cocktail. If you initialize the fake backing store, it goes out and looks for a sample data provider that goes with your entity manager. And so it's this interface that makes this possible. A sample data provider is always associated with a particular entity manager type. So you could actually separate your sample data by entity manager type if you wanted to.
Right. And in TempHire, we have the one type, TempHire entities. I guess there's also one for security.
There's one for security too, yeah. But we are actually setting it all up with the TempHire entities, entity manager in this case.
That's great.
And so really what's in here is there's one method that you implement from this interface, and it's the add sample data. It gives you an entity manager that you can play with. This entity manager that you get is disconnected. It has a cache-only query strategy, and it doesn't lazy load any navigation properties. So you can actually go crazy with this entity manager and set up your sample data, right, the way you want it. And so in this case, it's actually very simple. I'm setting up my static data, the phone types, the rate types, and all that. And then further down, I'm actually setting up some real sample data like Nancy. You will see Steve that we keep mentioning in here. So we're really setting up this known data pile that we can test against, that we can develop against, and all that.
And there's all kinds of ways I could do this. I could keep a serialized set of this stuff and just pour it in. There's just all kinds of ways I could populate this. Just go to town.
That's correct. Yeah.
Okay.
All right. So that's all about the domain services that we want to cover at this point.
In the next several videos, Marcel and I will explore the TempHire project. the main project of the application, and home to the views and view models that make up the UI. You'll find those videos and much more at cocktail.ideablade.com.